So before I begin with the topic analysis, I'd like to encourage all debaters to work as hard as possible during November, December, because a lot of schools simply take this topic off because there's winter break at the end, so there's only going to be like 2 or 3 tournaments on the topic anyways. So this is prime time for you to work as hard as possible so that you can qualify to state, TOC, or any tournament for that matter. So needless to say, I just encourage everyone to work really hard during this topic. All right, so absent that, let's begin with a little bit of the topic analysis. So first I want to show you 2 different political cartoons because I am obsessed with political cartoons. All right, so you should see the first. It's a picture of someone putting Google into a shredder. So this is just to show that when information is on the internet and people utilize the right to be forgotten, some people are making fun of the right to be forgotten by saying that Google will be completely shredded away. And here's the second political cartoon. It shows a student asking his teacher a couple questions, and the teacher says, "I'm afraid the right to be forgotten doesn't apply to answers to the questions on your test." However, I really do wish that it did apply. Obviously, the right to be forgotten doesn't mean completely shredding away Google, and maybe we can't use the right to be forgotten to forget incorrect answers on our tests, but hopefully at the end of this topic analysis, you will know a little bit more about what the right to be forgotten really is and some reasons as to why it's important or not important to have. So my goal is to give you some background on the topic, explain what the topic really means, and then give you a few starter ideas for arguments on the affirmative and the negative. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the background of the right to be forgotten, and that will lead right into some definitions about what the topic really is. So the internet is a relatively new thing. I made my Facebook when I was in middle school. My first Neopet was born when I was 8 years old. Not really sure if that's a thing anymore, but regardless, social media on top of that is especially a new thing. As we say goodbye to MySpace pics and hello and a big thumbs up to Facebook, nowadays everyone has social media, which allows me to stalk whoever I want. But I know everyone else does that. It can't be just me. But technology is kind of taking over our lives, but we let it take over our lives. We put insanely personal information on the internet. For example, there was a thief in my hometown of Houston, Texas, who was specifically figuring out which houses to target based upon what they posted on social media. So when they posted pictures of them in a foreign country, or maybe just set a status of saying IAH to LAX, then people knew that they're out of the house and that they could steal stuff from their house and not be caught. So that's an interesting example of where putting so much personal information up about ourselves had led to some disastrous outcomes. Facebook also has personalized ads based upon what you look at on other places of the internet. So eBay, Amazon, Google, etc. Those things pop up on your Facebook feed, so when you're scrolling through your news feed, you see a picture of whatever you were recently looking at on eBay. This is exactly why it's such a big debate right now, though. Some people don't realize that what they put on Facebook or other social media sites or anywhere on the internet for that matter is bad or good to post at that given time. And then years later, when they want to get a job or maybe apply to college, they end up not getting the job or not getting into the college because of certain information that was put on the internet, which is pretty interesting. So thus the idea of the right to be forgotten was born. This is definitely a hot topic, seeing as though the EU just made the right to be forgotten a right in May. This is a good place to start understanding what the topic really means. So a lot of authors will base their definition of what the right to be forgotten is based upon the EU's. So Robert Walker, who's a JD candidate at the University of California and the Hastings College of Law, defines it in a way that the European Union defined the right to be forgotten, saying that the right of individuals to have their data deleted when they are no longer needed for legitimate purposes. This applies where information is inaccurate, inadequate, irrelevant, or excessive for the purposes of data processing. So this right is not an absolute right and will always be weighed against other violations of rights, such as freedom of speech. This is a case-by-case analysis, so it will constantly be questioning whether or not it's too much of a violation of the freedom of speech or too much of a violation of any other freedom for that matter. And this is just to take information off of search engines like Google. So remember that the right to be forgotten is enacted like not seeing a link on Google. So when you type in something into a search engine, something will pop up and it will say certain sites or certain links have been taken off because of the right to be forgotten being enacted. So that's how you'll see the right to be forgotten being used and utilized if it were to become a civil right in the United States, like it is currently in the EU. So internet searches doesn't necessarily need to be defined in a case, but it is necessary and important to know in the topic. So internet searches simply means that those links will be taken off internet searches, but if you have the exact URL, then you can still find the information that you were originally looking for. And finally, there's the word civil right. And that's defined by Cornell University Law School as an enforceable right or privilege which, if interfered with by another, gives rise to an action for injury. So basically all this topic is asking about is whether or not a person ought to be able to forget past things that have happened that isn't necessarily fundamental to their future. So information that's not necessarily true anymore. So it should be pretty straightforward. This is definitely going to be a really interesting topic. It's not everyone was a little bit upset at the topic at first because there's not very much information out there on it, but I think there are a couple very unique core ideas that can be said for on each side. So also just remember with topicality issues, there'll probably be topicality issues with the right to be forgotten, maybe with the other phrases like civil rights, not so sure about those. So just asterisk those, star those, whatever you want to do in order to figure out what other people say the definition of the right to be forgotten is. So with that, we have a little bit of a background and an understanding of what the topic means. Let's take a look at some core ideas for affirmative arguments. So one core area are rights-based frameworks, and that would be a case that says that certain rights should never be violated even when in conflict with other rights. So we have a right to autonomy, privacy, or some other right. So Meg Ambrose, who is from Stanford, argued that the right to be forgotten is based off of an autonomy of an individual being a right holder in respect of personal information. So you could argue that the right to be forgotten is key to autonomy and have some Kantian framework. Others say that the right to be forgotten ought to be viewed as a property right or maybe an intellectual property. Personally identifiable information on an individual ought to be viewed as a property to that person because it's something very core to them. This can be coupled with a Lockean framework that argues that property rights matter, or even a Kantian framework that says that agency and property are connected, and if property were taken away, so would our agency. So that's more of a rights-based framework and those type of ideas. On the other end of the spectrum, there's our more utilitarian arguments. So utilitarian arguments would have a framework that basically says that we should ensure the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. So there are two main areas that I think you can argue for the affirmative in terms of util-based arguments. The first would be a relations advantage that says that the US and EU would have better relations if the US were to enact or say that the right to be forgotten is a civil right. Basically, the EU recently passed it, and a lot of countries are questioning whether or not the right to be forgotten ought to be a civil right. So if the US were to back up the EU on this and make the right to be forgotten a civil right, then we would have better relations with them, and that would increase our soft power. And there are lots of big, bad, scary impacts to that many people can argue. But it could also be argued on a smaller scale and say that good relations with other countries is generally good to protect citizens. So another argument for a utilitarian case would be an economy argument. So many argue that the digital economy is one of the fastest growing economies. Michael Venables from Forbes argues that building consumer trust is linked to economic development. Consumers whose data is protected will be willing to use new online services, use new technologies, and drive economic development. It goes on to say that the information security in the digital age of Europe constitutes around 5% of GDP, but contributes to an amazing figure of 25% of business research and development spending. The internet sector in Europe is growing by 12%, and that represents the entirety of Belgium's economy. So this is a really big deal. Internet economy is definitely one of the largest growing and probably will continue to grow as technology continues to take over our lives in the future. So this could be a very big argument and could link into, once again, those really big, bad, scary impacts like global economy or smaller smaller, more probable impacts about why having a good economy would probably lead to better quality of life on a multiple of different means. So those are the two main areas of arguments for the affirmative. Let's take a look at the negative. So a few stock arguments from, again, a utilitarian perspective, which is a similar framework as previously explained. There could be a couple different arguments you could make. The first, that is a very stock argument that multiple authors talk about, is the safety of people from criminals. So criminals will get out of prison and want to hide old information about themselves, hide why they got into prison in the first place, and other things. This could impact lots of people. For example, employers should probably know if their employees had any type of criminal background, if they were arrested, if they went to jail for 10 years. Very important things, at least for their safety, if not to help benefit their business, because lots of people might not go to specific businesses if they know that the people who work there are past criminals. There's a lot of potential harm to a lot of people if, for example, criminals were to abuse the right to be forgotten and try to completely forget their past criminal actions. So another argument would be government transparency. If the government were to do something similar as criminals and abuse the right to be forgotten, then they could erase a lot of information about poor policy choices all the way to massive rights violations. So think the US turns North Korea, but regardless of big scary arguments like that, transparency is generally good to have good trust between people and the government. Trust is necessary because multiple philosophers like Hobbes base the need to create government out of having good trust between citizens and the people in charge of them, the government, to ensure that the well-being and protection of citizens happens. Finally, there can be some more democracy arguments. The right to be forgotten decreases freedom of speech and freedom of memory by deleting old information. So basically, people no longer are free on the media to say whatever they want under certain rules. This could also take a step in a different direction to be an argument about how it violates constitutional rights. So those are some main arguments for the negative. Those are like just some utilitarian-based arguments, but overall, remember, the topic is basically a question of whether or not people should be allowed to forget information about their past that is no longer relevant to them in the future. Obviously, it's a little bit more intricate than that, but that's the basic question of the resolution. We went over possible affirmative and negative strategies. So for the affirmative, you can take a deontic approach where you protect rights to autonomy or rights to property and privacy, or a utilitarian approach that says that there's an increase of EU and US relations, or that it simply benefits the economy in lieu of benefiting the internet economy. For the negative, you can make arguments about criminals and the government abusing the right to be forgotten, and about democratic values going down and a violation of the Constitution. So those are just some general ideas of what's going on with this topic, some general starter ideas for different arguments you could make in favor and in opposing the topic. And hopefully now, if you take a look at those political cartoons again, you'll have a little bit more of a sense of what they actually mean. So we aren't deleting the entirety of Google, and we're not decreasing the accessibility of information necessarily. Also, you should probably know now that the right to be forgotten doesn't work for incorrect test answers, but what you should know is that it's definitely useful for some people in terms of protecting privacy, protecting rights to their intellectual property, and it could be potentially bad for others because of specific individuals like criminals or the government abusing that right to be forgotten. So good luck with the November-December topic. I hope that you enjoyed the topic, even though it's not very prevalent in the topic literature. There's not a lot of information about it, but remember, it's a very important topic that's currently being discussed by lots of people in the European Union. So you're talking about big major things that a lot of real politicians are talking about also. So you should be really excited about that. Good luck.